There's nothing quite like the sting of betrayal from your own blood. When family turns against you, it cuts deeper than any blade and leaves scars that never truly heal. Silas McGraw learned this hard truth when his own brothers stole everything he'd worked for and left him with nothing but a lonely rock by the sea. They called his final purchase worthless stone, good only for seagulls and salt spray. That was 20 years ago. Now the old man lives alone on that rock with his German shepherd, Boone, watching the waves crash while his brothers run the cattle empire that should have been his. But when Boone starts digging in a forgotten corner of the stone, what comes up from the buried past will change everything. The dog has found something the brothers never knew existed, something that could either restore Silas or destroy them all. Will this discovery finally give the old cowboy his revenge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific like a gray blanket, wrapping around Silas McGraw's weathered clapboard house that perched defiantly atop the towering sea rock. At 73, Silas had grown accustomed to the isolation, the constant sound of waves crashing against the stone foundation below, and the salt air that seasoned everything he owned. But he'd never grown used to the silence where his brothers' voices should have been. Boone, his 5-year-old German shepherd, padded across the worn wooden floor and pressed his warm flank against Silas's leg as the old man stood at the kitchen window, nursing his first cup of coffee of the day. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense when the past weighed heavy on his master's shoulders, and this morning carried that familiar ache of old wounds. "Just you and me again today, boy," Silas murmured, running his weathered fingers through Boone's thick coat. The dog's amber eyes looked up with the kind of unwavering loyalty that Silas had once believed existed between brothers. The McGraw cattle empire had begun with their grandfather, a tough Irish immigrant who claimed 1,000 acres of prime Texas grassland in 1887. Old Patrick McGraw had built it with nothing but grit, determination, and the kind of vision that sees green pastures where others see only scrubland. He'd passed it down to Silas's father, Connor, who'd expanded it to 3,000 acres and made the McGraw name synonymous with the finest cattle west of the Pecos River. Silas could still remember those golden years of his childhood, when he and his 2 younger brothers, Marcus and Thomas, had worked alongside their father, learning every aspect of the ranching life. Marcus, just 2 years younger than Silas, had always been the charmer, quick with a smile and quicker with words that could talk a man out of his last dollar. Thomas, the baby of the family by 5 years, had been the dreamer, always sketching plans for improvements and innovations that would make the ranch more profitable. In those days, they'd been inseparable, the 3 McGraw boys, their father used to say with pride, each bringing something unique to the family legacy. Silas provided the steady leadership and practical knowledge. Marcus brought the business sense and ability to negotiate deals. Thomas contributed the vision and planning that would carry them into the future. But somewhere along the way, greed had poisoned the well of brotherhood. Silas walked to the mantelpiece above his small stone fireplace, where a faded family portrait sat in a tarnished silver frame. The photograph had been taken in 1985, just before their father's unexpected death from a heart attack. In it, the 3 brothers stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the main ranch house, their father seated proudly in his chair before them. They all wore matching smiles and Sunday clothes, looking like men who had the world by the tail and knew it. How different things might have been if their father had lived another decade. Connor McGraw had possessed the wisdom and authority to keep his sons united, to help them see that their combined strengths made them stronger than any of them could be alone. But his sudden passing had left them rudderless at a time when the cattle market was shifting and modern ranching demanded new approaches. At first, they'd tried to honor their father's memory by working together. For nearly 3 years, the McGraw Ranch had continued to prosper under their joint leadership. Silas handled the day-to-day operations and cattle management. Marcus took care of the business side, negotiating contracts and managing their growing wealth. Thomas focused on modernization, introducing new technologies and breeding programs that increased their efficiency and profits. But success, Silas had learned, could be as dangerous as failure when it came to family dynamics. Marcus had been the first to show his true colors. He'd started making deals without consulting his brothers, using his charm to convince buyers and sellers that he alone spoke for the McGraw ranch. When Silas confronted him about it, Marcus had laughed it off, claiming he was just being proactive in securing better deals. But the pattern continued, and soon Marcus was treating Silas and Thomas more like employees than equal partners. Thomas, for his part, had grown increasingly resentful of what he saw as his older brother's resistance to his modernization plans. His innovations were sound, but they required significant upfront investment that made Silas nervous. The ranch was profitable, but taking on debt to fund Thomas's grand schemes seemed unnecessarily risky to a man who'd lived through his share of lean years. The real trouble had started when their father's will was finally settled. Connor McGraw had left the ranch to all three sons in equal shares, but he'd also left a separate piece of property to Silas alone, a strange, rocky outcropping by the Pacific Ocean that he'd purchased years earlier on what seemed like a whim. At the time, none of them had understood why their father would buy such an isolated, seemingly worthless piece of land. It was too far from the ranch to be useful for grazing, too rocky for farming, and too remote for development. Marcus and Thomas had immediately begun pressuring Silas to sell his share of the ranch and take the rock as his full inheritance. They presented it as a generous offer, claiming they could buy him out at above market value for his third of the ranch, leaving him free to do whatever he wanted with his retirement property. Silas had been reluctant at first. The ranch was his life, his identity, everything he'd worked for since childhood. But Marcus had been persuasive, painting pictures of the burden that would come with trying to manage such a large operation as they all grew older. Thomas had supported the idea enthusiastically, arguing that it would give him and Marcus the freedom to implement the ambitious modernization plans that Silas had been blocking. The final push had come when they presented him with detailed financial projections showing how much more profitable the ranch could be without what they called his conservative approach holding them back. They'd made it seem like he was being selfish by clinging to outdated methods that were limiting everyone's potential. And so, in a moment of weakness that he'd regretted every day since, Silas had agreed to the buyout. He'd taken their money, signed over his share of the ranch, and moved to the isolated sea rock that his father had left him. Marcus and Thomas had been all smiles and brotherhood as they'd seen him off, promising to stay in touch and include him in family gatherings. That had been 23 years ago, and the promised visits had never materialized. From his exile on the rock, Silas had watched from afar as his brothers had indeed modernized the ranch. But their success had come at a cost he wasn't sure their father would have approved of. They'd leveraged the property heavily, expanded aggressively, and eventually sold out to a large agricultural corporation for a sum that made them both wealthy beyond their father's wildest dreams. Marcus now lived in a mansion in Dallas, serving on corporate boards and playing golf with politicians. Thomas had used his share to start a consulting firm that advised ranchers across the Southwest on modernization strategies. Both had married well, raised families, and moved in social circles that had no place for a bitter old hermit. Living on a rock by the sea, for the first few years after the buyout, Silas had tried to maintain some connection with his brothers. He'd sent Christmas cards, birthday greetings, and occasional letters sharing news from his solitary life. But his communications had gone unanswered, and eventually he'd stopped trying. The message was clear. Now that they had what they wanted, the McGraw brothers had no more use for Silas. The isolation might have broken a weaker man, But Silas had found his own kind of peace on the rock. He'd built a simple but comfortable life, supplemented his buyout money with some small investments, and learned to appreciate the stark beauty of his oceanic home. The sunrises painted the eastern sky in colors that rivaled any masterpiece, and the sunsets over the Pacific provided a daily reminder that beauty could exist even in the loneliest places. And then, 5 years ago, Boone had come into his life. The German Shepherd had been a rescue dog, found abandoned and half-starved by the roadside near the coastal town where Silas bought his supplies. The local veterinarian had nursed the dog back to health, but had been unable to find him a permanent home. Something about the animal's intelligent eyes and dignified bearing had touched Silas's heart, and he'd impulsively offered to take him. It had been the best decision he'd made in decades. Boone had transformed from a broken, frightened animal into a magnificent companion whose loyalty and intelligence constantly amazed his master. The dog seemed to understand that Silas needed company without crowding, protection without aggression, and love without the complications that human relationships always seem to bring. Together, they'd established routines that gave structure to their days. Morning coffee while watching the sunrise. Afternoon walks along the narrow paths that wound around the rock's perimeter. Evening meals shared on the small deck that overlooked the endless Pacific. Simple pleasures that had helped heal wounds that Silas had thought would never stop bleeding. But lately, something had been different about Boone's behavior. The dog had become fixated on a particular spot near the northwestern corner of the rock, where centuries of wind and rain had carved deep crevices into the stone. He'd taken to sniffing around the area for long periods, occasionally pawing at loose dirt and debris that had collected in the deeper cracks. Silas had assumed it was just some animal scent that had caught the dog's attention, perhaps a rabbit or seabird that had taken shelter in the rocks. But Boone's interest had intensified over the past few weeks, and now he spent several hours each day focused on that same area, his behavior suggesting he was searching for something specific. This morning, as Silas finished his coffee and prepared for their daily walk, he noticed that Boone had already made his way to the familiar spot. But instead of his usual sniffing and casual pawing, the dog was digging with focused intensity, his powerful claws sending dirt and small stones flying as he worked to excavate something buried in the crevice. "What have you got there, boy?" Silas called out, setting down his empty mug and walking over to investigate. Boone looked up at his master's approach, his tail wagging with excitement, but immediately returned to his digging. Whatever he'd found, it was buried deeper than his previous investigations had revealed. Silas knelt beside the dog, his aging joints protesting the movement, and peered into the hole that Boone had created. There, barely visible beneath a layer of dirt and debris that looked like it had been undisturbed for decades, was the corner of something metallic, something that definitely didn't belong in a natural crevice of the rock. Silas felt his pulse quicken as he stared at the partially exposed object. In all his years on the rock, he'd never found any evidence that anyone had been here before him. His father had bought the property from the state, which had acquired it decades earlier when the previous owner had defaulted on taxes. As far as he knew, the rock had been uninhabited and unused for generations. So what was buried in his backyard, and how long had it been there? "Easy, boy," he murmured to Boone, whose digging had become even more frantic now that his master was showing interest. "Let's see what you've found." Silas's weathered hands joined the dog's efforts, carefully moving dirt and debris to expose more of the buried object. It appeared to be some kind of metal container, rusty with age but still intact. As they worked together, the outline of a rectangular box began to emerge from its earthen hiding place. Whatever Boone had discovered, it had been deliberately buried, hidden away by someone who had wanted to ensure it wouldn't be found by accident. The question was whether that someone had been Silas's father, or someone else entirely. As the morning fog began to lift and the sun climbed higher in the sky, Silas found himself facing the first genuine mystery his isolated life had presented in 20 years. After decades of predictable solitude, something from the past was about to intrude on his carefully constructed peace. He had no way of knowing that what lay buried in that ancient crevice would change everything he thought he knew about his family, his father, and the real reason his brothers had been so eager to send him into exile on this supposedly worthless rock by the sea. It took the better part of an hour to fully excavate the buried object from its hiding place in the rock's crevice. Working together with methodical care, Silas and Boone gradually exposed what appeared to be an old metal lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox but considerably heavier. The container showed significant rust and corrosion from decades of exposure to the salt air, but its basic structure remained sound. The box had been wrapped in what looked like oiled leather before burial, which had provided some protection from the elements. Whoever had hidden it here had taken considerable care to ensure its contents would survive. As Silas brushed away the last of the dirt and debris, he could see that the box bore no obvious markings or identifying information on its exterior. "Wow, boy, looks like you found us quite the mystery," Silas said, sitting back on his heels and studying their discovery. Boone wagged his tail proudly, clearly pleased with himself for uncovering something his master found interesting. The practical question now was how to open the thing. The lockbox appeared to have both a keyhole and a simple latch mechanism, but years of corrosion had left both features barely functional. Silas tried the latch first, working it gently to avoid breaking whatever internal mechanism might still be intact. After several minutes of patient manipulation, he felt something give way inside the lock, with a metallic groan that spoke of long disuse. The lid of the box slowly creaked open. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be additional layers of oiled cloth, were several packets of papers and documents. The preservation had been remarkably effective, while the edges showed some discoloration from age and moisture. The papers themselves appeared to be largely intact and readable. Silas's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first packet from the box. The top document was folded parchment that felt substantial and official. As he carefully unfolded it, he found himself looking at what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of his Sea Rock property, complete with topographical details and numerous notations written in a familiar handwriting, his father's handwriting. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Connor McGraw had created this map, which meant he had not only known about this hiding place, but had deliberately concealed these documents here. But why? And what could be so important that his father had felt the need to bury it rather than keep it with his other important papers? As Silas studied the map more closely, he began to notice details that made his pulse quicken. The drawing showed the rock's basic outline and elevation, but it also included numerous symbols and notations that suggested geological features. Small circles marked with numbers dotted the map, particularly concentrated on the northern and western faces of the rock. Lines drawn in red ink connected various points, creating patterns that looked almost like mining diagrams. Mining diagrams on his supposedly worthless sea rock. With growing excitement and confusion, Silas set the map aside and examined the next document in the packet. This one was typewritten on official letterhead from something called Pacific Geological Survey Company and dated March 15th, 1973, just 3 months before his father's fatal heart attack. The document was addressed to Connor McGraw and appeared to be some kind of preliminary report. As Silas read the technical language, certain phrases jumped out at him, promising mineral formations, significant quartz veining, potential for precious metal deposits, and most startling of all, recommend immediate comprehensive survey to determine commercial viability. His father had commissioned a geological survey of the rock, and according to this preliminary report, the results had been promising enough to warrant further investigation. Silas felt his world tilting as the implications began to sink in. If his father had known about potential mineral deposits on the rock, why had he never mentioned it? Why had he bought the property in the first place? And most troubling of all, had his brothers somehow known about this when they'd convinced him to take the rock as his inheritance? The third document in the packet was even more explosive. It was a letter from the same geological survey company, dated just 2 weeks before his father's death, confirming an appointment for a comprehensive mineral assessment of the property. The letter referenced their previous preliminary findings and expressed optimism about the potential for significant precious metal recovery from what they described as unusually rich quartz formations. But there was no follow-up correspondence, no survey report, no indication that the comprehensive assessment had ever taken place. His father's sudden death had apparently ended the investigation before it could reach its conclusion. Silas set the papers aside and reached for the second packet in the box. This one contained more personal documents, letters, and notes in his father's distinctive handwriting. The first letter was addressed to Silas himself, though it had obviously never been sent. "My dear son," it began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me before I could share what I've discovered about our family's future. The rock property I purchased last year isn't the worthless investment it appears to be. I've had reason to believe for some time that it contains mineral deposits that could make the McGraw name wealthy beyond our current dreams." Silas's hand shook as he continued reading. His father went on to explain that he'd first become suspicious about the rock's value when researching its history at the county courthouse. Previous owners dating back to the 1800s had included several mining companies and prospectors, all of whom had eventually lost the property to tax defaults or bankruptcy. But their failures, Connor had reasoned, might have been due to lack of proper equipment or financing rather than lack of minerals. The letter continued. "I've been very careful to keep this investigation secret from Marcus and Thomas for now. Marcus's business instincts are sharp, but his impatience might lead him to make premature moves that could cost us the opportunity. Thomas's enthusiasm for new ventures could lead to careless talk that might reach the wrong ears. When the survey is complete, and I know exactly what we're dealing with, I'll bring both your brothers into the planning." But his father had died before that conversation could take place, taking his secrets with him to the grave. The final document in the second packet was perhaps the most disturbing. It was a note, written in his father's increasingly shaky handwriting, that appeared to have been composed shortly before his death. "I'm growing concerned that someone else may know about the rock's potential. There have been strangers asking questions around town about mining claims and mineral rights. Marcus has been unusually interested in my business dealings lately, and I've caught him going through papers in my office. I may need to move more quickly than planned to secure our claim to whatever wealth lies beneath that rock." The note ended abruptly, as if Connor had been interrupted while writing it. Silas sat back against the rock face, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he'd discovered. His father had suspected that the sea rock contained valuable minerals. He'd commissioned professional surveys that had confirmed significant potential, and he'd been concerned that someone else, possibly even his own sons, might be trying to discover his secrets. Most devastating of all was the implication that his father's sudden death might not have been as natural as everyone had assumed. Boone seemed to sense his master's distress and moved closer, pressing his warm body against Silas's side. The dog's steady presence helped anchor him as the full magnitude of the discovery began to sink in. If his father's suspicions were correct, then the rock on which Silas had spent the last 20 years in exile might indeed be worth a fortune. The brothers who had mocked his worthless stone and convinced him to accept it as his full inheritance might have been playing a much deeper game than he'd ever imagined. But the most troubling question remained unanswered. How much had Marcus and Thomas known about the rock's potential value when they pushed him to take it as his inheritance. Had their generous bound offer been a calculated move to isolate him on valuable property until they could find a way to claim it for themselves? As the sun climbed higher and the morning mists finally cleared completely from the Pacific, Silas found himself facing the possibility that his family's betrayal had been even more calculated and cruel than he'd ever imagined. And if his father's final concerns had been justified, that betrayal might have cost Connor McGraw his life. The rusty lockbox sat beside him like an accusation, its contents having shattered 20 years of carefully constructed assumptions about his exile and his family's motivations. Boone had done more than uncover a buried box he'd unearthed, evidence of a conspiracy that reached back decades and might still be ongoing. For the first time in years, Silas McGraw felt the stirrings of something stronger than resignation. As he carefully gathered the documents and prepared to study them more thoroughly, he realized that his long exile might be nearing its end. The brothers who had stolen his birthright and mocked his supposedly worthless inheritance were about to learn that some secrets refused to stay buried forever. That evening, as the sun painted the western horizon in shades of orange and gold, Silas sat at his small kitchen table with the contents of the lockbox spread carefully before him. The ancient documents seemed to glow in the warm lamplight, each piece of paper representing a fragment of a puzzle that had remained hidden for over 2 decades. Boone lay at his feet, occasionally raising his head to study his master's face with those intelligent amber eyes. The dog seemed to understand that something momentous had occurred, and his protective instincts had been heightened since the discovery. Every sound from outside, the cry of a seagull, the crash of waves against the rock, the whistle of wind through the crevices caused his ears to perk up in alert attention. Silas had spent the afternoon studying the hand-drawn geological map with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The more he examined his father's careful notations, the more impressive the work became. Connor McGraw might have been a cattleman by trade, but he'd clearly educated himself in geological surveying with the thoroughness that had made him successful in everything he'd attempted. The map showed the rock divided into a grid system, with each section marked by coordinates and symbols that indicated different types of formations. The highest concentrations of promising markers were clustered on the northern face of the rock, the side that received the most protection from the prevailing winds and storms. It was also, Silas realized with growing excitement, the area where several natural caves and deeper crevices provided access to the rock's interior structure. But it was the red ink notations that truly captured his attention. These appeared to have been added later, possibly after the preliminary geological survey had been completed. Arrows pointed to specific locations where his father had written notes like primary vein, secondary deposits, and most intriguingly, follow the quartz line to main chamber. Main chamber. That suggested his father had discovered or suspected the existence of a significant underground cavity within the rock. Structure, exactly the kind of formation where precious metals would most likely accumulate over geological time periods. As darkness settled over the ocean, and the lighthouse beam from the distant shore began its nightly rotation, Silas turned his attention to the typewritten survey report. The technical language was challenging, but his years of practical experience had taught him to cut through jargon to find the essential information. The Pacific Geological Survey Company had been impressed by what they'd found during their preliminary investigation. Their report mentioned extensive quartz veining, consistent with hydrothermal activity, visible gold particulates in surface samples, and geological formations typical of successful mining operations in similar coastal mountain environments. Most significantly, they'd estimated that a comprehensive survey would cost $3,000, a substantial sum in 1973, but one that suggested they believed the potential returns would justify the investment. The preliminary findings had been promising enough that they'd recommended immediate action to secure mining rights and begin detailed extraction planning. But Connor McGraw had died before any of that could happen. Taking his secrets with him and leaving his sons to divide an empire they didn't fully understand, Silas picked up his father's unsent letter and read it again by lamplight, searching for clues he might have missed during his first examination. This time, one particular passage stood out with new significance. "I've been very careful to keep this investigation secret from Marcus and Thomas for now. Marcus's business instincts are sharp, but his impatience might lead him to make premature moves that could cost us the opportunity." His father had been concerned about Marcus's impatience and tendency to act before thinking through all the consequences. But what kind of premature moves had he been worried about? And why would secrecy be so important if they were dealing with property the family already owned? The answer, Silas was beginning to suspect, lay in the complex world of mining rights and mineral claims. Owning land didn't automatically guarantee ownership of what lay beneath it, especially if previous owners had sold mineral rights separately, or if government agencies had claims dating back to territorial days. His father's caution might have been based on a need to research and secure those rights before anyone else could challenge their claim. But Marcus, with his aggressive business instincts and impatience for immediate profits, might have pushed for quick action that could have exposed their discovery to competitors or legal challenges. In the mining business, Silas knew from his reading over the years, loose talk and premature claims had cost many families their potential fortunes. As he reread the final note about strangers asking questions and Marcus's unusual interest in their father's papers, a more troubling possibility began to take shape. What if Marcus had somehow discovered Connor's investigation before the old man's death? What if his brother's unusual interest had been more calculated than their father had realized? The timeline was certainly suggestive. Connor had died in June 1973, just weeks before his planned comprehensive survey was scheduled to take place. Marcus and Thomas had waited nearly 3 years before approaching Silas about the ranch buyout, time enough to research the rock's potential and plan their approach. And when they'd finally made their move, they'd been remarkably well prepared with financial projections, legal documents, and persuasive arguments about why Silas should accept the sea rock as his full inheritance. At the time, he'd assumed their thoroughness reflected Marcus's business acumen and attention to detail. Now he wondered if it had represented something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated plan to isolate him on valuable property while they positioned themselves to eventually claim it. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze flowing through his windows. If his suspicions were correct, then his 20 years of exile hadn't been the result of family dysfunction or business disagreements. It had been the product of deliberate deception designed to steal not just his share of the ranch, but his chance at the far greater wealth that lay hidden beneath his feet. Boone stirred at his feet, sensing the change in his master's emotional state. The dog's head came up, and he studied Silas's face with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding. Over the years, they'd developed a communication that went beyond words. And right now, Boone was clearly picking up on the anger and determination that were building in the old man's heart. "What do you think, boy?" Silas asked quietly, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Think it's time we found out what our family legacy really looks like." As if in response, Boone rose to his feet and moved to the window that faced north toward the area where they'd made their discovery. His posture was alert and focused, as if he could sense that their investigation was far from over. Silas gathered the documents carefully and returned them to the lockbox for safekeeping. Tomorrow, he would need to begin the delicate process of verifying his father's findings without alerting anyone else to what he'd discovered. The preliminary geological report was over 20 years old, and mining technology had advanced significantly since then. A modern survey might reveal far more about the rock's potential than his father had ever imagined. But he would need to proceed carefully. If Marcus and Thomas had been planning to claim the rock for themselves, they might have people watching for any signs that he was investigating its value. The strangers his father had mentioned asking questions around town might have been the beginning of a surveillance operation that could still be ongoing. As he prepared for bed that night, Silas felt more alert and energized than he had in years. The discovery of his father's secrets had awakened something in him that he thought was permanently buried beneath 2 decades of resignation and isolation. For the first time since accepting his brother's buyout offer, he was beginning to believe that he might have the power to change his circumstances. The question now was whether he had the courage to act on what he'd learned, knowing that the stakes might be far higher than he'd ever imagined. The next morning brought with it a sense of purpose that Silas hadn't felt in decades. As he prepared his coffee and watched the sunrise paint the eastern sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, he found himself studying his surroundings with new eyes. The rock that had been his prison for 20 years might actually be the key to his redemption. After breakfast, he returned to the lockbox and carefully examined the remaining documents he hadn't fully explored the previous evening. Beneath the geological reports and his father's letter, wrapped in an additional layer of oiled cloth, he discovered something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a leather-bound journal, small enough to fit in a man's jacket pocket, with C.J. McGraw Private embossed in faded gold letters on the cover. His father's personal journal, hidden away like a treasure more valuable than any gold or silver that might lie beneath the rock. With trembling fingers, Silas opened the journal to its first page. The entries were dated, beginning in January 1973 and continuing right up until a week before his father's death. Connor McGraw's distinctive handwriting filled the pages, documenting not just his geological investigation, but his growing concerns about his family and the future of the McGraw legacy. The early entries were straightforward, accounts of his initial interest in the rock property. Connor had first learned about it during a conversation with a retired mining engineer at a Cattlemen's Association meeting. The engineer had mentioned that several coastal properties in the area had shown promising mineral signs in the past, but had been abandoned due to the remote locations and high costs of extraction. The old-timer told me that modern equipment and better transportation might make some of those old claims profitable again, one entry read. He specifically mentioned the Sea Rock property that's been sitting empty for 15 years. Said the previous owners went broke trying to mine it with 1920s technology. But that didn't mean there wasn't gold there for someone with better tools and more patience. That conversation had sparked Connor's interest, leading him to research the property's history at the county courthouse. What he discovered there had convinced him to make an offer immediately. The records show that between 1885 and 1955, no fewer than 6 different mining companies tried to work this rock, Connor had written. Every one of them found enough gold and silver to keep them interested, but the logistics of getting equipment out there and ore back to processing facilities bankrupted them all. But what if a man wasn't trying to run a full-scale mining operation? What if he just wanted to extract enough wealth to secure his family's future? The journal entries revealed that Connor's purchase of the rock had been far from impulsive. He'd spent months researching mining techniques, studying geological surveys of the surrounding area, and quietly consulting with experts about the feasibility of small-scale precious metal extraction. But it was the later entries, written in the months before his death, that truly captured Silas's attention. His father's handwriting had grown increasingly urgent, and his concerns had shifted from technical questions about mining to more personal worries about his family's dynamics. Marcus has been asking too many questions about my business investments, read an entry from April 1973. Yesterday, he wanted to know why I'd been meeting with geological surveyors and what properties I'd been looking at. I told him I was just diversifying our holdings, but his interest seemed more than casual. I'm beginning to wonder if I should have kept this investigation even more private. The entries continued to document Connor's growing unease about his middle son's behavior. Marcus had apparently started showing up at the ranch office at unusual hours, asking to review financial records and property documents. He'd also begun cultivating relationships with local businessmen who might have information about mining claims and mineral rights in the area. I caught Marcus going through my desk again last night. Connor had written 2 weeks before his death. When I asked what he was looking for, he claimed he was trying to find the insurance papers for the cattle operation, but the insurance documents are in the filing cabinet where they've always been. He was looking at my personal correspondence and the geological reports I've been keeping locked in the desk drawer. The final entries were the most disturbing. Connor had become convinced that Marcus was planning to move against him in some way, though he wasn't sure what form that action might take. I think Marcus suspects what I've discovered about the rock, though I can't imagine how. Read an entry from just 10 days before Connor's fatal heart attack. He's been pushing hard for us to modernize the ranch operation, take on more debt, expand faster than our cash flow can support. When I've resisted, he's accused me of being too conservative, of holding back the family's potential. But I wonder if he's trying to create financial pressure. That would force us to sell assets, including the rock property he doesn't know I've bought yet. The journals. Final entry was dated 3 days before Connor's death and consisted of only a few lines. Something's not right. Found evidence that someone has been in my office when I wasn't there. Important papers have been moved, though nothing seems to be missing. I think it's time to confront Marcus directly about what he knows and what he's planning. The rock survey results should be in next week. After that, everything will have to come out in the open anyway. But Connor McGraw had died before that confrontation could take place, and his secrets had died with him until Boone's persistent digging had brought them back to light. Silas closed the journal and sat back in his chair, his mind racing as he tried to process the implications of what he'd read. His father hadn't just suspected that the rock contained valuable minerals. He'd been convinced that Marcus knew about the investigation and was planning to use that knowledge. Somehow the timeline painted a picture that made Silas's blood run cold. If Marcus had indeed discovered Connor's geological investigation, then Connor's sudden death from a heart attack might not have been the natural tragedy everyone had assumed. Heart attacks could be induced, especially in a man already under stress from family conflicts and business pressures. And if Marcus had been responsible for their father's death, then the subsequent campaign to convince Silas to accept the rock as his inheritance took on an even more sinister character. It wouldn't have been just about stealing his share of the ranch. It would have been about completing a murder plot by isolating the primary witness to Connor's investigation on the very property that had motivated the crime. The thought that his own brother might be murderer was almost too horrible to contemplate. But as Silas reviewed everything he'd learned over the past 24 hours, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together with terrifying clarity. Marcus had the motive. Potential wealth from mineral rights worth far more than the cattle ranch. He'd had the opportunity access to Connor's office and papers that would have revealed the geological investigation. And he'd certainly demonstrated the ruthless business instincts that could have driven him to eliminate any obstacle to his plans. Most damning of all, Marcus's behavior in the years since Connor's death had been entirely consistent with a man who knew exactly what lay beneath the sea rock and was patiently waiting for the right moment to claim it. Boone stirred from his position by the window, sensing the change in his master's emotional state. The dog approached Silas's chair and placed his large head on the old man's knee, offering the kind of wordless comfort that had sustained them both through years of isolation. "I think we're going to need help, boy," Silas said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "This is bigger than just family problems. If I'm right about what happened to my father, then we're dealing with something that goes way beyond stolen inheritances." As the morning sun climbed higher and the fog began to clear from the ocean, Silas found himself facing a decision that would determine the rest of his life. He could return the documents to their hiding place, pretend he'd never found them, and continue living his quiet exile until natural death claimed him as it had claimed his father. Or he could fight back against the brothers who had stolen his birthright and possibly murdered his father, knowing that the battle ahead would be dangerous and that he might not survive to see justice done. For the first time in 20 years, Silas McGraw felt the stirrings of the man he'd once been, the eldest son who'd been raised to protect the McGraw legacy and defend his family's honor. That man had been beaten down by betrayal and isolation, but he'd never been completely destroyed. Now, armed with his father's secrets and his own burning need for justice, that man was ready to emerge from exile and reclaim what had been stolen from him. 3 days after discovering his father's journal, Silas made his decision. He would not let Connor McGraw's death go unavenged, nor would he allow his brothers to profit from what might have been murder. But before he could take any action, he needed to understand exactly what legal rights he possessed and what weapons he could bring to bear in the battle ahead. The lockbox had contained one more document that he'd saved for last, the original deed to the Sea Rock property. Now, with his morning coffee cooling beside him and Boone lying watchfully at his feet, Silas spread the legal document across his kitchen table and began to study it with the careful attention his father had taught him to give to any contract or agreement. What he discovered made his pulse quicken with something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. The deed was more comprehensive than he'd remembered from the hurried signing ceremony 23 years ago. At the time, he'd been so focused on the emotional pain of leaving the ranch and so eager to escape his brothers' pressure that he hadn't carefully examined every clause and provision. Now, reading with the wisdom that comes from age and the motivation that comes from betrayal, he found details that changed everything. The property description was precise and legally binding. All rights, titles, and interests in the coastal rock formation known locally as Sentinel Rock, including but not limited to surface rights, subsurface mineral rights, water rights, and exclusive access privileges. The language was clear and unambiguous. He owned not just the rock itself, but everything beneath it, around it, and on it. But it was a particular clause buried in the middle of the document that truly captured his attention. Grantor hereby conveys all previously reserved mineral rights dating back to the original territorial land grant of 1847, including any claims, deposits, or discoveries made subsequent to this conveyance. Silas had to read that section 3 times before its full significance sank in. The deed didn't just give him ownership of potential future mineral discoveries. It retroactively granted him rights to any minerals that had been found by previous owners or claimants going back over a century. If his father's geological surveys had been correct, and if valuable deposits existed within the rock, then those deposits belonged to him absolutely and without question. More importantly, the deed made it clear that his brothers had no legal claim whatsoever to the property or its contents. Whatever Marcus and Thomas might have known or suspected about the rock's value, they had signed away any rights to it when they'd convinced him to accept it as his full inheritance. Their signatures were right there on the document, witnessed and notarized, legally binding under any interpretation of property law. For the first time since finding the lockbox, Silas allowed himself to smile. His brothers had been so confident in their manipulation, so certain that they were palming off worthless stone on their gullible older brother, that they'd been sloppy with the legal details. In their eagerness to be rid of him, They'd given him ironclad ownership of what might be the most valuable property in the McGraw family's history. But the deed revealed something else that was equally significant. The document showed that Connor McGraw had purchased the property not from the state, as Silas had always believed, but from a private party, a mining company called Pacific Coastal Extractors that had gone into bankruptcy in 1969. The purchase had been completed in February 1973, just 1 month after Connor's first JOURNAL entry about his interest in the property. That timing suggested his father had moved very quickly once he decided the rock was worth investigating. But it also raised new questions about what Pacific Coastal Extractors might have known about the property's value and why they'd been willing to sell it at what Connor's records indicated was a remarkably low price. Silas made a mental note to research the mining company's history when he had access to public records. If they'd conducted their own geological surveys before going bankrupt, those surveys might still exist somewhere and could provide additional evidence about the rock's mineral potential. As he continued studying the deed, another detail caught his attention. The property boundaries were described with unusual precision for what everyone had assumed was worthless land. The surveyor had marked not just the basic outline of the rock, but it included detailed measurements of caves, crevices, and underground formations. Someone had clearly believed this property was worth mapping in extraordinary detail. The boundaries also extended further than Silas had realized. In addition to the main rock formation where he built his house, the deed included several smaller rock outcroppings connected by underwater formations that were exposed only at low tide. If mineral deposits existed in the main rock, they might extend through the entire underwater ridge system, potentially making the property worth even more than his father's most optimistic projections. But as encouraging as the legal documentation was, Silas knew it represented only the beginning of his challenge. Proving ownership was one thing. Actually extracting any wealth from the property was quite another. Modern mining operations required substantial capital investment, environmental permits, and technical expertise that he simply didn't possess. More immediately, he needed to verify whether his father's geological theories had been correct. The preliminary survey from 1973 was promising, but 23 years of technological advancement might reveal different results. And until he knew for certain what lay beneath his feet, he couldn't plan any kind of strategy for dealing with his brothers or claiming his potential inheritance. The practical problem was how to conduct a modern geological survey without alerting Marcus and Thomas to his investigation. If they'd been watching the property for years, which seemed increasingly likely given what he'd learned about their behavior, then any sudden activity might trigger whatever contingency plans they'd develop for claiming the rock. But Silas had one advantage his brothers probably hadn't counted on. His years of isolation had taught him patience and careful planning. Unlike Marcus, he wouldn't rush into action before understanding all the variables. Unlike Thomas, he wouldn't let enthusiasm override prudence. He would investigate thoroughly, plan meticulously, and strike only when he was certain of success. That afternoon, as Boone dozed in a patch of afternoon sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, Silas began drafting a plan. He would start by researching modern geological survey techniques and identifying companies that could conduct discrete assessments. He would investigate Pacific Coastal Extractors and try to locate any records they might have left behind. And he would begin documenting everything he discovered, creating a paper trail that would survive even if something happened to him. Most importantly, he would be patient. His brothers had waited over 20 years to make their move. He could afford to wait a few more months to ensure his counterstrike was devastating and final. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, Silas felt a sense of purpose and energy he hadn't experienced since his youth. The defeated old man who'd accepted exile and betrayal was gone, replaced by someone who remembered what it meant to be a McGraw and to fight for what was rightfully his. The battle for his family's legacy was about to begin, and this time he intended to win. 2 weeks of careful research had yielded results that exceeded even Silas's most optimistic expectations. Working methodically through public records, historical archives, and industry databases accessible through the coastal town's small but well-connected library, he had uncovered a trail of evidence that painted a picture of conspiracy reaching back decades. The final piece of the puzzle had been hidden in the lockbox all along, tucked beneath his father's journal in an envelope he'd initially overlooked. Inside was a professional geological assessment report, not the preliminary survey he'd already found, but a complete, comprehensive analysis dated just 1 week before Connor McGraw's death. The document bore the letterhead of Morrison and Associates, geological consultants, and was signed by Dr. Eleanor Morrison herself, one of the most respected mining geologists on the West Coast. As Silas read through the technical language and detailed findings, he realized that his father had commissioned far more than a simple mineral survey. Dr. Morrison's report was nothing short of explosive. The Sentinel Rock Formation exhibits mineral characteristics consistent with the richest gold and silver deposits found anywhere along the Pacific coast, the report began. Core samples taken from 3 strategic locations confirmed the presence of high-grade ore veins extending throughout the rock's internal structure. Conservative estimates suggest extractable precious metal deposits worth approximately $2.8 million at current market prices, with potential for significantly higher yields pending more extensive excavation. But the report's most shocking revelation came in its final paragraph. Of particular note is evidence suggesting previous extraction activities dating to the 1940s and 1950s. Abandoned mining equipment discovered in natural cave systems indicates the Pacific coastal extractors achieved limited success before financial difficulties forced cessation of operations. Remaining ore deposits appear to be substantial and readily accessible using modern extraction techniques. Silas set the report down with shaking hands. His father had died knowing that the sea rock contained nearly $3 million in precious metals, and that was using 1973 prices. Adjusted for inflation and current market values, the deposits could be worth 10 times that amount or more. More disturbing was the implication that Pacific coastal extractors had indeed found gold and silver before going bankrupt. The company hadn't failed because the rock was worthless. They'd failed despite its wealth, probably due to the high costs and logistical challenges of operating such a remote mining site in the pre-modern era. But Dr. Morrison's report had included recommendations for overcoming those historical obstacles. Modern equipment, improved transportation methods, and new processing techniques could make extraction profitable even for a small-scale operation. The rock that had bankrupted multiple mining companies in the past could now make a single owner wealthy beyond imagination. Silas's research into Pacific coastal extractors had revealed additional troubling details. The company had indeed gone bankrupt in 1969, but not before spending 3 years trying to find a buyer for their mining claims. According to business records filed with the county, they'd received several inquiries from potential purchasers, including one from a business entity called MCG Holdings that had shown particular interest in their coastal properties. MCG Holdings. McGraw Holdings. The connection was too obvious to be coincidental. Further investigation had revealed that MCG Holdings had been incorporated in Texas in 1971 and listed Marcus McGraw as its primary shareholder and director. The company's stated purpose was investment in mineral rights and extractive industries, exactly the kind of business that would be interested in acquiring promising but temporarily unprofitable mining claims. Timeline painted a devastating picture. Marcus had been researching and planning to acquire the rock property as early as 1971, 2 full years before Connor's geological investigation and 3 years before Connor's death. Somehow, Marcus had learned about Pacific Coastal Extractors' discoveries and had positioned himself to acquire their assets when they went bankrupt. But Connor McGraw had moved faster, purchasing the property directly before Marcus could complete his acquisition through MCG Holdings. That explained the unusual interest in Connor's business affairs that the journal had documented. Marcus hadn't been casually curious about his father's investments. He'd been desperately trying to understand how Connor had learned about and acquired the property Marcus had been planning to claim for himself. The implications were staggering. Not only had Marcus known about the rock's mineral wealth when he'd convinced Silas to accept it as his inheritance, but Marcus had been actively working to acquire the property for years before Connor's death. The generous buyout offer that had seemed like brotherly concern for Silas's future had actually been the culmination of a multi-year conspiracy to steal the most valuable asset in the McGraw family's history. But the most disturbing discovery had come when Silas researched Dr. Eleanor Morrison's fate. The geologist who had prepared the comprehensive assessment of the rock's value had died in a car accident just 3 weeks after Connor McGraw's heart attack. Her death had been ruled accidental break, failure on a winding mountain road near her home, but the timing seemed remarkably coincidental. 2 people who knew the truth about the rock's mineral wealth had died within a month of each other, both from seemingly natural or accidental causes. That could be coincidence. But Silas's growing understanding of his brother's ruthless business practices made more sinister explanations seem increasingly plausible. As the afternoon sun slanted through his kitchen windows, Silas spread all the documents across his table and studied them together. The evidence of conspiracy was overwhelming, but proving it in any legal forum would be challenging. Marcus had been careful to cover his tracks, and the deaths of the 2 people who could have provided the most damaging testimony had eliminated the strongest potential witnesses. But Silas had one advantage Marcus probably hadn't anticipated: time. His exile on the rock had lasted over 2 decades, during which Marcus had apparently been content to wait for natural causes to remove the final obstacle to his plans. That patience had been Marcus's mistake, because it had given Silas the opportunity to discover the truth and plan his response. More importantly, the comprehensive nature of Dr. Morrison's report meant that Silas could now proceed with confidence. He didn't need to risk exposing himself by commissioning new geological surveys or bringing in outside experts who might alert his brothers to his investigation. He had professional confirmation that the rock contained substantial mineral wealth, legal documentation proving his exclusive ownership, and evidence strongly suggesting that his father's death had been part of a decades-long conspiracy. The question now was how to turn that knowledge into justice. Boone stirred from his afternoon nap and approached Silas's chair, sensing the intensity of his master's emotions. The dog had been unusually alert over the past few weeks, as if he understood that the buried secrets he'd uncovered had changed everything about their quiet existence. "We're going to need to be very careful from here on out, boy," Silas said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "If I'm right about what Marcus did to our father and Dr. Morrison, then he's not going to hesitate to eliminate us if he realizes what we've discovered." As if in response to his words, Boone moved to the window that offered the best view of the narrow path leading up from the shore. His posture was alert and focused. The same stance he adopted when unfamiliar boats appeared near the rock or when unusual sounds carried across the water from the mainland. Silas joined the dog at the window and studied the peaceful scene below. The tide was coming in, and the late afternoon light painted the ocean in shades of deep blue and gold. Everything appeared normal and tranquil, but he could no longer take that appearance at face value. For all he knew, Marcus had been having the property watched for years, waiting for signs that Silas had discovered the truth about its value. The long period of apparent neglect might have been a carefully crafted illusion, designed to keep him complacent, while his brothers positioned themselves for their final move. And if that were true, then his recent research activities might already have triggered alarms that would bring the confrontation he'd been preparing for sooner than he'd planned. But as Silas stood at his window, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon, he realized that he was no longer the broken, defeated man who had accepted exile 23 years ago. The discovery of his father's secrets had rekindled something in him that his brothers had thought was permanently extinguished. The fighting spirit of a man who knew the difference between justice and revenge, and who was prepared to risk everything to ensure that truth prevailed over conspiracy. The battle for his family's legacy was about to enter its final phase, and Silas McGraw intended to be ready. Silas discovered the letter on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 1 month after Boone had first started digging in the rock's crevice. It was tucked under a loose stone near his front door, placed there sometime during the night while he slept. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, just his name written in Marcus's distinctive handwriting. The fact that his brother had been on the rock, had walked right up to his house while he slept, sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. For 23 years, Marcus and Thomas had maintained the pretense that they'd forgotten about their exiled brother. Now, suddenly, that pretense had been abandoned. With trembling fingers, Silas opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of expensive letterhead bearing the logo of Marcus's Dallas law firm. The message was brief and devastating in its implications. Dear Silas, I trust you've been enjoying your solitude on our father's old rock. I hope you've also been enjoying the little treasure hunt that's been keeping you so busy lately. Yes, we've been watching. We've always been watching. Did you really think we'd give you that property without understanding exactly what it contained? Did you honestly believe that Father's death was the convenient coincidence it appeared to be? You always were the naive one, big brother. The mineral rights you've been researching so carefully belong to us now. We've spent the last 20 years ensuring that every legal avenue for claiming them has been thoroughly prepared. Your supposed ownership was always temporary, a necessary fiction, to keep you isolated and harmless while we completed our arrangements. Thomas and I will be visiting you this Friday to discuss the transfer of the property to its rightful owners. I suggest you be prepared to cooperate. At your age, accidents can happen so easily, especially on such a remote and dangerous rock. It would be a shame if you suffered the same kind of unfortunate incident that befell Dr. Morrison all those years ago. We'll be bringing some associates to help with the transition. I'm sure you'll find their arguments quite persuasive. Your loving brother, Mircusps. That German shepherd of yours has been remarkably helpful in our surveillance efforts. Amazing what dogs will do for the right treats. You might want to reconsider who you trust. The letter slipped from Silas's numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. The full scope of his brother's conspiracy was finally revealed, and it was far worse than even his darkest suspicions had imagined. They hadn't just known about the rock's value when they'd convinced him to take it as his inheritance. They'd orchestrated the entire situation from the beginning. His exile hadn't been the result of family dysfunction or business disagreements. It had been a carefully planned isolation strategy designed to keep him prisoner on valuable property until they were ready to claim it. More horrifying was Marcus's casual admission that their father's death hadn't been natural. The heart attack that had devastated the family and derailed Connor's plans to secure the mineral wealth for his sons had been murder cold. Calculated murder committed by his own children. And Dr. Morrison's death hadn't been an accident either. The geologist who had confirmed the rock's wealth had been eliminated to ensure her silence, just as Connor had been eliminated to prevent him from protecting his discovery. But the most devastating revelation came in the postscript about Boone. Silas turned to look at his faithful companion, who was lying peacefully by the fireplace, and felt his world collapse around him. The dog who had been his constant companion, his source of comfort and protection, had been compromised. The brothers who had destroyed his life had turned even his most trusted relationship into another tool of surveillance and control. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was telling the truth about Boone, then his brothers had been receiving detailed intelligence about Silas's activities for years. They'd known about his daily routines, his emotional state, his level of suspicion about the past. Most critically, they'd probably known about his discovery of the lockbox from the moment it had happened. Silas's mind raced as he tried to process the timeline. Boone had started digging in the crevice several weeks ago, eventually uncovering the buried documents that had revealed the truth about the conspiracy. But what if that hadn't been accidental? What if Boone had been trained to search for and uncover those specific documents? The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Marcus would have known from his father's journal and Dr. Morrison's report that Connor had hidden evidence somewhere on the rock. But the property was large, and the hiding place could have been anywhere. A systematic search by human agents would have been obvious and risky. But a dog could search everywhere without arousing suspicion, and could be guided to specific areas through careful training and reward systems. Boone's persistent interest in that particular crevice hadn't been canine instinct. It had been the result of conditioning designed to lead Silas to discover the evidence his brothers wanted him to find. But why would they want him to know the truth about the conspiracy? The answer came to him with sickening clarity. They'd wanted him to understand the full scope of his defeat before they destroyed him completely. Marcus had spent over 2 decades planning this moment, the revelation that Silas had never been in control of his own fate, that every choice he'd made had been manipulated, that even his most trusted companion had been working against him. It was psychological warfare, designed to break his spirit completely before they moved in for the final kill. But as Silas stood in his kitchen, holding the letter that detailed his brother's treachery, he realized that Marcus had made a crucial miscalculation. The revelation of Boone's betrayal was devastating, but it was also liberating. For the first time in 23 years, Silas knew exactly where he stood and exactly what he was fighting against. His brothers had always underestimated him, dismissing him as the simple rancher who lacked their sophistication and business acumen. They'd assumed that learning the truth about their conspiracy would crush his spirit and make him easier to eliminate. Instead, it had awakened something in him that they'd forgotten existed, the iron will that had made the McGraw name respected throughout Texas. Marcus's letter had also revealed critical information about their plans. They were coming on Friday with associates hired muscle to ensure his cooperation or elimination. That gave him 3 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether the McGraw legacy would belong entirely to murderers. More importantly, they clearly believed they held all the advantages. They thought they knew his capabilities, his resources, and his mental state. They expected to find the same broken, isolated old man who had meekly accepted exile 23 years ago. They were about to discover how wrong they could be. As Silas picked up the letter and read it again, this time looking for tactical intelligence rather than emotional revelations, he began to feel something he hadn't experienced since his youth. The thrill of preparing for a battle he intended to win. Boone stirred from his place by the fireplace and padded over to Silas's side, pressing his warm flank against the old man's leg in a gesture of comfort and loyalty that had sustained them both through years of apparent companionship. But now Silas understood that every such gesture had been calculated. Every moment of seeming devotion had been an act designed to maintain his emotional dependence on a compromised asset. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Marcus and Thomas had done to him directly. But as he looked down at the intelligent amber eyes that had deceived him so completely, Silas realized that Boone might also be the key to turning the tables on his brothers. Carefully laid plans. They believed they controlled every aspect of the situation, including his primary relationship with his supposed companion. But what if that control could be reversed? What if the surveillance asset they'd placed in his home could become a weapon in his arsenal? Dogs, Silas knew from a lifetime around animals, were capable of fierce loyalty to their true masters. But they were also capable of learning new loyalties when circumstances changed dramatically. And Marcus's letter had just changed everything. The battle for the McGraw legacy was about to begin. And for the first time in over 2 decades, Silas McGraw felt ready to fight back with everything he had. Wednesday morning brought gray skies and a stiff ocean breeze that seemed to mirror the storm building in Silas's heart. He had less than 48 hours to prepare for a confrontation that would likely determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. But for the first time in decades, he felt truly alive, energized by the prospect of finally settling accounts with the brothers who had stolen everything from him. The first order of business was to explore the rock more thoroughly than he'd ever done in 23 years of residence. If he was going to defend his home against multiple attackers, he needed to understand every advantage the terrain could provide, starting with the area where Boone had discovered the lockbox. Silas began a systematic examination of the rock's cave system. What he found astonished him. The natural formations extended much deeper into the rock's interior than he'd ever realized, creating a network of chambers and tunnels that would have taken sophisticated equipment to explore properly. But someone had explored them. In the largest chamber, roughly 50 feet from the main entrance and accessible only by crawling through a narrow passage, Silas discovered evidence of the mining operations that Dr. Morrison's report had referenced. Ancient drilling equipment, rusted beyond use but still recognizable, set alongside pickaxes and shovels that dated back decades. Most significantly, he found several wooden crates marked Pacific Coastal Extractors explosives. The dynamite inside was old enough to be dangerous in ways its original users hadn't intended. But careful examination revealed that some of the charges were still intact and potentially functional. More importantly, the mining company had left behind detailed maps of the cave system, hand-drawn on waterproof paper and stored in a metal container that had protected them from decades of moisture and salt. The maps revealed that Pacific Coastal Extractors had discovered and excavated far more of the rocks interior than anyone had known. They'd created access tunnels, storage chambers, and even a primitive workshop area deep within the stone. Most remarkably, they'd apparently found a natural chimney that extended from the main chamber system to a concealed opening near the rock summit, a perfect escape route or defensive position for anyone who knew it existed. But the most important discovery came in what the miners had labeled their equipment room, hidden beneath decades of debris and carefully camouflaged. Silas found something that made his pulse race with possibilities. His father's hidden weapons cache. Connor McGraw had indeed prepared for a fight that never came. Wrapped in oilcloth and stored in waterproof containers, he'd hidden an arsenal that spoke to both his military experience and his growing paranoia about his family's safety. 2 hunting rifles, a shotgun, 3 handguns, and enough ammunition to sustain a small war. Most importantly, Connor had included detailed notes about defensive positions, sightlines, and tactical advantages that the rock's unique geography could provide to a defender who understood how to use them. "If you're reading this," Connor's note began, "then something has happened to me before I could protect our family's legacy myself. The rock isn't just valuable for its minerals, son. Its position and structure make it one of the most defensible pieces of property on the coast. The old miners knew this. That's why they chose it despite the logistical challenges. 3 men with rifles and enough ammunition can hold this position against 50 attackers, if they know what they're doing." The note continued with tactical assessments that revealed Connor's military background in ways Silas had never fully appreciated. His father had served in Korea, and the lessons he'd learned about defensive positions and asymmetric warfare had apparently stayed with him through decades of civilian life. "The key is controlling the approaches," Connor had written. "There's only one practical landing spot for boats, and it's completely exposed to defensive fire from multiple positions. The path up from the water is narrow and offers no cover for attackers. Anyone trying to take this rock by force would have to climb directly into prepared positions of a tactical nightmare for assault forces." As Silas studied his father's defensive plans and compared them to the current situation, he began to understand why Marcus had chosen to rely on psychological warfare and legal maneuvering rather than direct confrontation. A frontal assault on the rock would be costly even with superior numbers, especially if the defender was prepared and properly positioned. But Marcus's letter had indicated that he was bringing associates for Friday's visit, hired muscle who would presumably be armed and experienced in violence. The question was whether they would be prepared for the kind of defensive advantages that Connor McGraw had recognized and prepared for decades. Earlier, Silas spent Wednesday afternoon positioning weapons and ammunition in the defensive locations his father had identified. The main house commanded an excellent view of the water approach and the path leading up from the shore. The cave system provided fallback positions that could be held independently, with interlocking fields of fire that would make any assault extremely costly. Most importantly, the hidden escape route to the summit meant that he could disappear into the rock's interior and emerge at an unexpected location if the primary positions became untenable. But hardware was only part of the equation. If he was going to survive a confrontation with multiple attackers, he needed every psychological and tactical advantage he could create. That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific in spectacular shades of orange and gold, Silas turned his attention to the problem of Boone. The revelation that his faithful companion had been compromised was still painful, but it also represented an opportunity. If Marcus expected to receive intelligence reports about Silas's activities and state of mind, then controlling that intelligence could be a powerful weapon. The question was whether Boone's loyalty could be redirected, or whether the dog's conditioning was too deeply ingrained to overcome. Silas had spent 5 years building what he believed was a genuine relationship with the animal. But now he needed to determine how much of that relationship had been real and how much had been manipulation. Over the next several hours, he conducted careful tests of Boone's responses and behaviors. The results were both encouraging and troubling. The dog clearly had genuine affection for Silas. His responses to praise and physical attention were too spontaneous and enthusiastic to be purely trained behaviors. But there were also signs of deeper conditioning that suggested Marcus's people had indeed been using Boone to monitor the situation on the rock. The dog's reactions to certain verbal cues and hand signals revealed training that Silas had never provided. More tellingly, Boone showed subtle signs of stress when Silas handled the weapons he'd retrieved from his father's cache, as if he'd been conditioned to report such activities to his other handlers. But dogs, Silas knew from decades of experience with working animals, could be remarkably adaptable when circumstances changed dramatically. Their loyalty was genuine, but not necessarily exclusive. And dramatic shifts in pack dynamics could realign their allegiances in ways that even professional trainers couldn't completely predict. Thursday morning, Silas put his theory to the test. Instead of his usual routine, he spent several hours in intensive training with Boone, using techniques he'd learned as a young man when helping train cattle dogs on the ranch. But instead of herding commands, he focused on defensive and protective behaviors, teaching the dog to recognize threat signals, respond to silent hand commands, and most importantly, to distinguish between friend and enemy in complex situations. The results exceeded his expectations. Whatever conditioning Marcus's people had provided, they hadn't accounted for the dog's natural intelligence and adaptability. Within hours, Boone was responding to new commands and showing clear understanding of the changed dynamics. More encouragingly, he seemed to relish the intensive training and attention, as if he'd been waiting for Silas to become the kind of decisive leader the dogs instinctively respected. By Thursday evening, Silas was confident that Boone's loyalties had shifted decisively. The dog's body language and responses indicated that he now saw Silas as his primary pack leader, whatever his previous conditioning might have been. More importantly, Boone seemed to understand that a confrontation was coming and that his role would be to protect his master rather than report on his activities. As the final sunset before Marcus's promised visit painted the sky in brilliant colors, Silas completed his preparations. Weapons were positioned and tested. Defensive positions were prepared and rehearsed. Escape routes were cleared and marked. Most importantly, his strategy was finalized. He would not wait passively for his brothers to arrive and dictate the terms of engagement. Instead, he would use the next 24 hours to ensure that when the McGraw family's final confrontation came, it would happen on his terms and in circumstances that maximized his advantages, while minimizing theirs. Marcus had spent decades planning this moment, confident that his superior resources and ruthless tactics would overwhelm his supposedly broken older brother. But Marcus had made the same mistake. That had doomed every military force that had ever underestimated a defender fighting for his home and his honor. He'd forgotten that the McGraw name had been built by men who never surrendered what was rightfully theirs, and who never backed down from a fight when principle was at stake. Tomorrow would determine whether that legacy belonged to murderers and thieves, or to a man who remembered what justice meant and was prepared to pay any price to achieve it. For the first time in 23 years, Silas McGraw was ready to remind his brothers exactly who they were dealing with. They came at dawn, just as the first pale light of Friday morning began to chase away the darkness over the Pacific. Silas had been awake for hours, positioned in the main house's front window with his father's hunting rifle and a clear view of the water approach. Boone lay beside him, alert and silent, his newly redirected loyalty evident in every line of his powerful body. The boat that appeared through the morning mist was a sleek cabin cruiser, expensive and fast, exactly the kind of vessel Marcus would choose for an operation he wanted to complete quickly and efficiently. Through his binoculars, Silas counted 5 figures on deck, his 2 brothers and 3 other men who had the hard, professional look of hired muscle. Marcus stood at the bow wearing an expensive suit that looked completely out of place on a boat, approaching a remote sea rock. Even from a distance, his arrogant posture and confident gestures broadcast his certainty that this would be a simple matter of overpowering one isolated old man and claiming the property he'd coveted for decades. Thomas was more subdued, staying near the cabin and avoiding eye contact with the approaching shore. He'd always been the weak link in their partnership, more follower than leader, and his body language suggested he was less comfortable with whatever violent resolution Marcus had planned. The 3 hired men moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals. They checked weapons, studied the rock's terrain, and positioned themselves for rapid deployment once the boat reached the narrow beach below. Their leader, a tall man with graying hair and military bearing, used binoculars to examine the path leading up to Silas's house, clearly assessing defensive positions and potential threats. "Well, boy," Silas murmured to Boone, "looks like our family reunion is about to begin." The dog's ears twitched in acknowledgement, but he remained perfectly still, watching the approaching boat with predatory intensity. Whatever conditioning he'd received from Marcus's people, it was now completely overwhelmed by his protective instincts toward his true master Dot as the cabin cruiser maneuvered toward the small landing area. Silas moved from his observation post to the first defensive position his father had identified, a natural rock formation that provided excellent cover while commanding the entire approach path. He'd spent yesterday morning reinforcing the position with additional stones and debris that would stop rifle rounds while leaving clear fields of fire toward anyone climbing up from the water. The boat's engine cut off as it scraped against the rocky shore. Through a gap in his stone barricade, Silas watched his brothers and their hired muscle disembark with the casual confidence of men who expected no real resistance. Marcus led the way, carrying an ornate walking cane topped with a golden handle, a symbol of the wealth and status he built on lies and murder. He moved up the narrow path with the same arrogant swagger he displayed 40 years earlier when charm and manipulation had been enough to get him whatever he wanted. "Silas," Marcus called out when the group had climbed roughly halfway up the path. "We know you're up there, big brother. No point in hiding like a scared rabbit. We've got legal papers and 3 very persuasive gentlemen who'd prefer not to have to search for you." Silas remained silent, watching as the 5 men continued their approach. They were still in the most vulnerable part of the path, completely exposed to defensive fire with nowhere to take cover if shooting started. Connor McGraw's tactical assessment had been perfect. Any assault force would have to climb directly into prepared positions under constant fire from multiple angles. "Come on, Silas," Thomas called out, his voice less confident than Marcus's. "We just want to talk. There's no need for this to get complicated. We can work out something that's fair for everyone." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. After decades of exile, murder, and conspiracy, Thomas was still trying to present their theft as some kind of reasonable business negotiation, but his nervous tone suggested he understood better than Marcus what kind of tactical disadvantage they faced climbing that exposed path. The hired gunmen were more professional in their assessment. Their leader had stopped a group about 30 yards below Silas's position and was studying the terrain with obvious concern. Military experience had apparently taught him to recognize a kill zone when he saw one. "Mr. McGraw," the professional called out, "my name is Reynolds. I'm here to help resolve this situation peacefully. We know you've discovered some documents that have upset you, but there's no need for anyone to get hurt today." Reynolds was trying to sound reasonable, but his hand rested casually on the pistol holstered at his side. His 2 associates had spread out to either side of the path, trying to minimize their exposure while maintaining positions that would let them return fire quickly if necessary. "Your brothers have legal claim to this property," Reynolds continued. "The mineral rights you think you own were transferred to them years ago through legitimate business transactions. We're here to help you understand the situation and relocate to more suitable accommodations." That was when Silas knew there would be no peaceful resolution. Marcus's letter had been blunt about their intentions, but he'd clearly instructed his hired muscle to try psychological pressure first. The lies about legal transfers and legitimate business transactions were designed to make him doubt his position and surrender without a fight. But Marcus had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. The broken man who might have accepted such lies had died the moment Boone uncovered that lockbox. In his place stood someone who remembered what it meant to be a McGraw and who understood that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. Silas checked the rifle's safety and settled the weapon's stock firmly against his shoulder. The first shot would transform this from a psychological operation into open warfare. And once that line was crossed, there would be no going back. Through his rifle scope, he could see Marcus's face clearly for the first time in over 2 decades. His younger brother had aged well, his features still sharp and aristocratic despite the gray in his hair. But there was something cold and predatory in his expression that spoke to the ruthless calculation that had driven him to murder their father and steal their family's legacy. Marcus raised his gold-headed cane and pointed it directly at Silas's defensive position. "Last chance. Big brother," he called out. "Come down here peacefully, or we'll come up there and drag you down. Either way, this rock becomes ours today." The arrogance in that gesture, using the symbol of his stolen wealth to threaten the brother he'd betrayed, crystallized everything Silas felt about the injustice that had defined the last 23 years of his life. His finger tightened on the trigger as Connor McGraw's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes a man has to fight for what's his, son. And when that time comes, you make sure you fight to win." The shot echoed across the water like thunder, and Marcus's golden cane shattered in his hands as the rifle bullet found its mark. The ornate walking stick symbol of wealth built on murder and betrayal exploded into fragments that scattered across the rocky path like the remnants of his arrogant confidence. "Down! Get down!" Reynolds shouted, his professional training taking over as he dove for the limited cover provided by a small outcropping of stone. The other 2 gunmen followed suit, scrambling for whatever protection they could find on the exposed path. But Marcus and Thomas, with no military experience to guide them, stood frozen in shock for several precious seconds. They expected psychological intimidation and legal maneuvering, not a shooting war with a brother they dismissed as broken and harmless. "He's actually shooting at us," Thomas cried, his voice cracking with panic as the reality of their situation finally penetrated his mind. "Marcus, you said he'd surrender. You said he wouldn't fight." "Shut up and get behind cover," Marcus snarled, finally diving behind a boulder as Silas's second shot chipped stone fragments from the path where he'd been standing. The urbane businessman who'd orchestrated decades of conspiracy was discovering that real violence was very different from the sanitized elimination of inconvenient witnesses he'd arranged in the past. Reynolds was already organizing his team's response. "Johnson, work your way up the left side. Patterson, cover him and watch for muzzle flashes. I'll take the center approach." But as the hired gunmen began their coordinated assault up the narrow path, they quickly discovered why Connor McGraw had considered the rock virtually impregnable. Every step forward exposed them to fire from multiple angles, while Silas remained invisible behind stone formations that provided perfect cover. His third shot took Johnson in the shoulder as the man tried to advance along the path's left edge. The gunman spun and fell, crying out in pain as blood stained his jacket. The wound wasn't fatal, but it effectively removed him from the fight and demonstrated that Silas's marksmanship was both precise and deadly serious. "This is insane," Thomas shouted from his inadequate hiding place behind a collection of loose stones. "We're pinned down by one old man. Can't we just leave and come back with more people?" "No." Marcus's voice carried a rage that 20 years of careful planning couldn't contain. "I'm not backing down when we're this close. I've waited too long and spent too much to let that crazy hermit keep what belongs to us." Reynolds was reassessing the tactical situation with the cold professionalism that had kept him alive through multiple conflicts. "Mr. McGraw," he called out, "you've made your point, but you're outnumbered and we have superior firepower. Surrender now, and we can end this without anyone else getting hurt." Silas's response came in the form of another carefully aimed shot that struck the rock inches from Reynolds's head, showering him with stone chips and making it clear that negotiation was no longer an option. That's when Boone made his move. The German shepherd had been waiting patiently beside his master, but the familiar sound of gunfire and the scent of blood had awakened every predatory instinct in his powerful frame. At Silas's quiet command, the dog slipped away from the defensive position and began working his way down through the rock's cave system toward the path, where the attackers were pinned down. Patterson, the remaining mobile gunman, was concentrating so intently on trying to spot Silas's position that he never noticed the large dog emerging from a concealed cave opening behind him. Boone's attack was swift and silent, 80 pounds of muscle and fangs striking without warning from an impossible angle. Patterson's scream echoed off the rock walls as Boone's jaws clamped down on his gun arm, the weapon clattering away across the stones as man and dog rolled together in a violent struggle. The gunman tried to reach his backup pistol with his free hand, but the dog's training and natural intelligence made him a formidable opponent even for an experienced fighter. "Get that animal off me," Patterson shrieked, but Reynolds was too busy trying to avoid Silas's rifle fire to provide assistance. The tactical situation had deteriorated from difficult to desperate in a matter of seconds. Marcus, watching his expensive hired help being systematically neutralized by his supposedly helpless brother, finally abandoned his hiding place and charged up the path in a fury of rage and frustration. The gold-headed cane was gone, but he still carried the pistol he'd brought for the final confrontation he'd always planned to have with Silas. 23 years. He screamed as he ran toward Silas's position, firing wildly and inaccurately as emotion overwhelmed tactical sense. 23 years I've waited to finish this. I killed the old man. I killed that nosy geologist, and I'll kill you too. The admission of murder, shouted across the rock for all to hear, confirmed everything Silas had suspected about his father's death and Dr. Morrison's convenient accident. But it also revealed something equally important. Marcus was no longer thinking clearly. His careful planning, shattered by the unexpected resistance he'd encountered. Silas rose from behind his stone barricade as his younger brother charged toward him, and for a moment the years fell away. They were no longer the elderly men they'd become, but the young brothers who'd once worked side by side building their family's cattle empire. Marcus's face, twisted with rage and desperation, showed traces of the charming boy who'd been able to talk his way out of any trouble. But that boy had grown into a murderer, and this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Marcus had chosen wealth over family. Conspiracy over honor. The original mining claim document, the final piece of evidence that proved Silas's absolute ownership of the rock and its treasures, lay in his shirt pocket, pressed against his heart as he raised his father's rifle for the shot that would end the McGraw family's civil war forever. In the distance, Thomas was screaming for his brothers to stop. Reynolds was shouting tactical commands that no one was following, and the wounded Johnson was trying to crawl to safety down the treacherous path. But none of that mattered now. This moment had always belonged to the two brothers who'd loved each other once, before greed and betrayal had poisoned the well of family loyalty beyond any hope of redemption. The gunshot that ended Marcus McGraw's charge echoed across the Pacific like a final judgment, carrying with it the weight of 23 years of injustice and the promise of justice finally served. Marcus stumbled, dropped his pistol, and fell to his knees on the rocky path, his hand pressed against the shoulder where Silas's bullet had found its mark. "It's over, Marcus," Silas said quietly, emerging from his defensive position with his father's rifle still trained on his wounded brother. "No more lies. No more murders. No more stealing what doesn't belong to you." Thomas had finally found his courage, but it was the wrong kind desperation rather than conviction. He pulled his own weapon and pointed it at Silas with shaking hands. "Let him go, Silas. He's hurt. He needs medical attention. What he needs, Silas replied, without shifting his aim from Marcus, is to answer for what he did to our father, and to Dr. Morrison, and to the 23 years of my life he stole with his lies. Reynolds, the professional gunman, had seen enough. His team was decimated, his employer was wounded and exposed, and the tactical situation was hopeless. This isn't over, he called out as he began helping the wounded Johnson retreat down the path toward their boat. You can't prove anything, and there are legal documents that say this property belongs to your brothers. Actually, Silas said, reaching into his shirt pocket and withdrawing the original mining claim. There are legal documents that say this property and everything beneath it belongs to me, exclusively and permanently. Documents that my father signed and your employer witnessed before arranging his convenient heart attack. The papers fluttered in the ocean breeze as Silas held them up for all to see. 23 years of exile, loneliness, and bitter resentment had led to this moment. Revelation that Connor McGraw's careful planning had anticipated every aspect of his son's conspiracy and provided the legal foundation for its ultimate defeat. Marcus looked up from his wounded shoulder, his face pale with blood loss and the growing realization that his lifetime of manipulation and murder had been undone by the very man he dismissed as too simple to threaten his plans. You don't understand, he gasped, trying one last time to regain control of the situation. The mineral wealth under this rock is worth millions. More than enough for all of us to live like kings. We could be partners instead of enemies. Partners? Silas's voice carried decades of accumulated pain and anger. Like we were partners when you murdered our father? Like we were partners when you exiled me to this rock while you stole everything he built? Like we were partners when you used my own dog to spy on me? Thomas lowered his weapon, his hand shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip. Silas, please. I didn't know about father. I swear I didn't know Marcus killed him. I thought it really was a heart attack. But you knew about the mineral rights, Silas replied. You knew what this rock was worth when you convinced me to take it as my inheritance. You helped plan 23 years of exile based on a lie. The admission in Thomas's eyes was answer enough. The baby brother who'd once been the dreamer of the family, the one with plans and visions for their shared future, had sold his integrity for wealth and status just as surely as Marcus had sold his soul for power. Boone padded up the path, his muzzle showing traces of blood from his encounter with Patterson, but his tail wagging with satisfaction at a job well done. The dog pressed against Silas's leg in a gesture of loyalty and protection that was now genuine rather than calculated. The authorities are going to want to hear Marcus's confession, Silas said, looking down at his wounded brother. Convenient that he shouted it loud enough for everyone to hear. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, theft, quite a list for a supposedly respectable businessman. You can't prove anything, Marcus said through gritted teeth, though his voice lacked its former confidence. It's your word against mine. Actually, Silas pulled out a small digital recording device from his pocket. It's your own words. I've been recording everything since you arrived, including your very helpful confession about killing our father and Dr. Morrison. The blood drained from Marcus's face as he realized that his moment of rage-fueled honesty had provided all the evidence needed to convict him of murder. 23 years of careful planning and patient manipulation had been destroyed by 30 seconds of uncontrolled emotion. Reynolds and the surviving gunman had reached their boat and were already starting the engine, abandoning their wounded employer to face the consequences of his failed conspiracy. Professional soldiers understood when a mission had become irretrievable, and they had no intention of facing murder charges for a client who could no longer pay their fees. As the cabin cruiser disappeared into the morning mist, Silas found himself alone with his brothers on the rock that had been his prison for over 2 decades. But the isolation that had once felt like punishment now felt like sanctuary, a place where truth could finally be spoken and justice could finally be served. "Thomas," he said to his younger brother, "you have a choice to make. You can call the authorities yourself and tell them what you know about Marcus's crimes. Or I can call them and you can explain why you chose to be an accessory after the fact." Thomas looked at Marcus, then at the recording device in Silas's hand, and made the decision that might salvage some remnant of his integrity. He pulled out his cell phone and began dialing 911. As the sound of approaching helicopters eventually broke the morning, silenced Coast Guard rescue units responding to Thomas's call, Silas stood at the edge of his property and watched the sun climb higher over the Pacific. The same sunrise he'd watched for 23 years now carried different meaning. Instead of marking another day of exile and bitter memories, it illuminated the beginning of a new chapter in the McGraw family legacy. Boone sat beside him, no longer a tool of surveillance, but a true companion who'd proven his loyalty when loyalty mattered most. Together, they defended their home against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious through careful preparation, tactical intelligence, and the kind of courage that came from fighting for principles rather than profit. The mineral wealth beneath the rock would indeed make Silas wealthy beyond his father's wildest dreams. But the real treasure he'd recovered wasn't gold or silver. It was his family's honor, his father's vindication, and the knowledge that sometimes, if a man was patient enough and determined enough, justice could prevail even against the longest odds dot in the distance. Marcus was being loaded into a medical helicopter, his shoulder wound serious but not life-threatening. He would survive to face trial for murder, conspiracy, and decades of fraud. Thomas sat in handcuffs beside Coast Guard investigators, providing a detailed confession that would ensure Marcus's conviction and his own reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. As the helicopters departed and silence returned to the Sea Rock, Silas McGraw finally allowed himself to smile. After 23 years of exile, he was no longer the banished brother living on worthless stone. He was the last heir to a family legacy, built on honor and defended with blood, a legacy that would never again be threatened by those who confused wealth with worth or power with righteousness. The new family portrait would show an old man and his loyal dog, standing together on a rock that had transformed from prison to kingdom, watching over an ocean that had carried away the last remnants of betrayal and brought in the tide of justice at long last.